Hi, I'm Bonnie Dawdy, and I have been a Rotarian for over 10 years. In honor of Rotary International World Polio Day, I would like to tell you a story that I hope will warm your hearts and fill you with the magic. One person can accomplish much in the world despite hardships and difficulties. Betty June was born in 1922 in the town of Susanville, California, then a logging and mining community in Northern California north of Lake Tahoe. She was a young, precocious, and curious child who loved swimming, the nature around her, and was gifted with a beautiful soprano voice. In 1931, her childhood happiness was brought to an abrupt end when she contracted the polio virus while she and her older brother and sister swam in the popular Fly Shacker swimming pool in San Francisco. They recovered quickly with no recurring or lasting effects, but Betty did not and endured a grueling 4+ years struggle, much time spent hospitalized, both in an iron lung at Stanford University and at home using a portable iron lung, which was brought to her home in Burlingame, California. She was left with paralysis in both legs, one arm, and overall muscle weakness and fatigue. She kept a diary, writing about her hopes, fears, and experiences, and she wrote poetry. During this time, if she was able, she rode with a family member every week over 40 miles of mountain roads. Mind you, this was in the 30s in Reno, Nevada, in order to continue with her music and vocal lessons, which she loved and looked forward to. She attended public schools alongside her older brother and sister, and they were very protective of her, and they stood by as she suffered through many surgeries. After homeschooling and upon entering elementary school and throughout high school, she found her way to classrooms carrying an extra 20 pounds in the form of leg braces and heavy crutches. Wearing a back brace, she learned to ride horseback and became an excellent swimmer, in spite of her lack of leg strength. She was determined to not stop any of her previous activities. She refused to be the recipient of pity or sympathy. She neither expected or asked for extra favors from either family or friends, and they respected this. However, she does tell the story of not being included in her elementary school classroom picture and cried because the location of the school grounds was not accessible to her and no one tried to help her. Continuing her vocal lessons, she became soloist for the high school glee club. She was editor of the radio cinema paper and carried a full academic load. She won the Martha Bell Bullitt Literary Award for Poetry and became an active member of the Poets of the Pacific. She was quite the social butterfly in high school. She was pretty and she was very outgoing. She didn't let her physical limitations get in the way of having fun. At graduation, she was speaker and wrote the cover poem on the program cover. When her adoring friends and classmates surprised her with the wheelchair at graduation, she cried, not so much for joy, but deep inside thinking that she may never walk again, but did admit later that it would be easier to get around in a wheelchair. She enrolled at San Jose State College to study vocal music. Previously, after more surgery, she was able to drive using one leg and one strong arm and hand. She wrote radio script and directed a school radio program, was soloist for the a cappella chorus, and won the coveted Phelan Award for her poetry. She sang in church choirs, community choral groups, and for a number of civic programs. She was the darling of Burlingame. Betty never refused an engagement if it was at all possible. A story has been told of her when she was in her 20s, stranded on the side of the road in her car that had stopped working. She didn't want to be late to the meeting she was expected to attend, so she removed the chair from the back seat, scooted on into it, and using her arms, pushed herself down the road. This small, delicate young lady, barely 5 feet tall, in a wheelchair or on crutches with braces, seemed to carry her performances with much of the energy and vitality characteristic of her famous aunt, Jessie Isabel Christian, prima donna opera star of two continents. She once remarked in a military newspaper that, quote, my singing was a nice entry into a good social life, and that it was. When the Second World War swooped upon our country, Betty, along with thousands of young people, young men and women, answered the call. With driving enthusiasm, she plunged into the task of doing everything possible in her power to boost the morale of our troops. Although she earned her living working as a public relations officer, greeter at the USO bowling alley in the Bay Area, and secretary of the USO's office in San Francisco, she found time to fill numerous engagements as an entertainer for the Air Force, Army, and naval hospitals, accompanied often by a young Merv Griffin who accompanied her on the piano. She sang at USO clubs, the American Red Cross, and the American Women's Voluntary Services, or AWVS. Betty would be seen swinging down the hospital corridors on crutches, which she sometimes wore, smiling and calling to the boys as if she was the luckiest girl alive. She sang for those stationed at Treasure Island, Hamilton Field, Camp Shoemaker, Concord Air Base, and Fort Baker. She seemed tireless in her unselfish efforts to give of her time and talents. Betty conducted her own radio program with the initial setup and guidance partnering with Ira Blue over KJBS called the GI Hit Parade, writing her script and singing requested songs for the homesick GIs. The program's goal was to improve public relations between the servicemen away from home and the people on the West Coast. She urged families to invite the boys into their homes for dinner, barbecues, and family like activities. She and her parents became, quote, family, unquote, to many young men and women, frequently hosting get togethers at their home in Burlingame Hills. A news article wrote of her during one of her many concerts for service members at the USO. She pushed her wheelchair with the arms removed to the center of the stage, fluffed her skirt, and waited for a beautiful spotlight to shine from above. The sailors and service members cheering her on with whistles and shouts. Betty had many suitors at the time. Someone who is a history buff may ask for proof of this, and there is. She saved letters from over 20 suitors she corresponded with during the war, but the one who captured her heart and courted her was a sailor from New Orleans who she met at the USO bowling alley. They built a home together, figuratively and literally, just down the canyon from her parents' home. Betty gave birth to 2 healthy children, 18 months apart. She continued to be very independent, always striving to better herself, continuing her music and quest for education. She was devoted to her family and played a large role in her children's lives, driving them to brownies, Cub Scouts, and a Girl Scout leader, an active member of the PTA. She continued singing and playing her guitar and was a great fan of folk music, attending workshops in Monterey and Asilomar in the company of Pete Seeger and others. She also studied architecture and got her license to be an architectural designer, and along with Fred, her husband, for 8 years, designed and built custom homes in Hillsborough, Burlingame Hills, Pacifica Oakland Hills, and the Grass Valley area for Al Addles, the head coach, and recently the late general manager for the Golden State Warriors. She always felt it was good to give back to her community and did so in many ways. When her children were in high school, she returned full time to pursue a degree in psychology and sociology at San Francisco State, driving herself into the city almost daily to classes. She graduated magna cum laude in 1969. She then continued her education driving across the Bay Bridge to Cal Berkeley, where she graduated with a master's degree in social work. By this time, she was using hand controls in her trusty Ford Mustang. She also was continuing her volunteer work as a mental health assistant at Peninsula Hospital in Burlingame, California. She and Fred moved to South Lake Tahoe in 1973. She was looking for volunteer opportunities and not finding any, was driven to form an alliance between volunteers and those needing help. What a true Rotarian. She created and became the executive director of Voluntary Action Center in South Lake Tahoe. In her own words, the importance of volunteer work cannot be underscored enough. It is preventative mental health. The South Lake Tahoe Voluntary Action Center developed projects with help from community members such as Volunteers in Action, Legal Information Services, Meals on Wheels, Information and Referral Services, Big Brothers and Sisters, Community Council on Human Needs. At one time, there's having 5 full-time employees and 60 active volunteers. The center is still active today. The winter weather was hard on her, and she was developing post-polio syndrome, which included increased fatigue, joint and muscle pain, difficulty breathing, and sensitivity to the cold. They relocated to the gold mining area of Grass Valley, California, and its neighbor, Nevada City. Betty continued her involvement in social work as a private clinician while they lived there. However, she became frustrated with the town's limitations and her ability and that of others to move around effectively due to lack of access to public buildings, shops, and services. She was fortunate that Fred would scoop her up out of her wheelchair, as he did many times, to place her once again in her wheelchair or onto a piano stool or chair. At the time, while serving as a volunteer on a local committee in Grass Valley, she challenged the mayor and the quote, city movers and shakers, unquote, to a day in a wheelchair going about their daily routines, confronting obstacles which included wooden sidewalks, raised with no way to access them in order to enter businesses, shops, and restaurants. She loved to read, and there were concrete steps to climb to access the library and government building, placards with restaurant menus and sales information littering the sidewalks, etc. Well, guess what? She was able to obtain funding, actually double what was sought, through an active campaign and publicity to construct small ramps and a wide ramp to her beloved library. While in Grass Valley, she developed and named an organization called FREED, the Foundation of Resources for Education and Employment for the Disabled. This organization is still present, has grown and partnered with organizations, and is an active nonprofit jewel in the community and the state it serves. Then she took a hiatus, traveled by herself in her wheelchair, flying to Rome, then Dubrovnik, today's Yugoslavia, and then on to Paris, Copenhagen, and home, all by herself. In 1987, suffering from the progression of post-polio symptoms, she realized she had no choice but to have surgery to place a Harrington rod along her spine to hold it straight so she could breathe more easily. Unfortunately, she suffered a brainstem stroke days after the surgery and died at the age of 64. In 1989, 2 years after her death, an indoor heated therapy pool for Western Nevada County's disabled and the public was dedicated in honor of her and Tom Selinsky, both driving forces behind the effort to construct the facility. It was the organizers' hope the pool can be used to make for the disabled a safe, relaxing place with warm water for relaxation and used by the disabled in the community. This has been the story of a most remarkable and talented woman. She was a model for many without allowing her disability from polio to get in the way of her success and perseverance. This remarkable and talented woman was my mother, Betty Davis.